Salute Philologus and Julia, Nereus and his sister, and Olympus, and all the saints which are with them. Salute one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you. And with that, we end our list of saints mentioned by the Apostle Paul. That is, greeted by the Apostle Paul, those which he seemingly knew at Rome or knew something about them. I don't have anything particular to say about this little house church, but it does have a bearing on something I want to share with you tonight around the theme, the improbable possibility. Even these last names illustrate that the church at Rome was remarkably diverse. In this last group, these people who were in one of these churches, a house church as we call them, these are the names of slaves. Philologus and Julia, Nereus and his sister and Olympus are common slave names. And all the saints with them, whoever they were. But he seems to be referring to a cluster of saints gathered at one of the little churches that met in Rome. He knew of them, he wrote about them. In previous chapters or previous verses, he mentions other house churches. And he mentions perhaps the leaders or those that he knew. And some of those are a mixture of free names, of slave names, some women. Remember that he greeted, beginning with Priscilla, a wife, with Mary, a single woman, and with Rufus's mother, a mother. So he's greeting a wife, a single woman, and a mother, all outstanding people in the church at Rome. So we have to recognize that this was a diverse membership, both of Jew and Gentile, slave and free, male and female. Now that's more diverse than what we have. When you've got Jew and Gentile, with a heavy tradition that the Jewish people, many of them kosher, many of them observant Jews, then, more like James and his ministry. And then you have the Gentiles. And then you have both slave men and free men in the same church. And you have not only male and female, but you have female that are leaders and prominent in the church. If I'm not mistaken, isn't Priscilla mentioned first here? Yes. Priscilla and Aquila. And scholars tell you that's because she was the leader of the two. Paul really called her Prisca. It's more rightly translated. He never referred to her as Priscilla. But anyway, you'll notice that her name's listed first. In fact, the person who carried the letter was from Cenchrea, and her name was Phoebe. So the lady that's going to read the letter perhaps to them, the person is a woman. And Priscilla is the outstanding person of this couple. And I'm pointing all this out to tell you that there is an improbable possibility as far as the church being one in Rome. I'm also trying to point out that the improbability of the possibility is greater there than here. Because a slave man who has no rights thinks different than a free man. All of you are free. You think in terms of freedom. A woman in that church had no legal rights. At least the Hebrew women did. I don't think the Greek women did either. or the Roman women. So they had all the rights were around the men. And yet in Christ, there is no male nor female. See, bond or free, Jew nor Greek. And so in the freedom of the church, you have two things on your hand. People are more together and more unified, but the possibility of division is greater because they're freer. Possibility of disruption and of exercising individual rights or expressing individual needs, that possibility is greater because there are people here who are free who have never been free before. The slave has not been free. The female has not been free. And in a religious service where the remnant has come out of Judaism, being first of all the Jews, and then the God-fearers, some of them, if not most of them, coming with them, because most everybody came out of the synagogue. Very little of the New Testament church came off of the heathen field. Almost none. Nearly all the church started from the going to the synagogues and also spreading from the God-fearers who saw the universality of Christ and saw that it was not necessary for them to be circumcised in order to be acceptable before God or to keep all of the laws that were involved here. Now, I'm wanting you just to think along with me because I'm simply entitled The Improbable Possibility. There's a possibility of the church at Rome being one. There's a possibility. Now, I put improbable here because it's so diverse. And yet I want to remind you of something. It was of this church that Paul said that their faith and obedience was known around the world. In this very diverse and individualistic, I don't think that's quite fair to say individualistic because that almost means self-assertive. And it doesn't appear that she was like that. But in this very diverse church, very gifted church, there was a unity that caused their faith and their obedience to be known abroad. For your obedience has come abroad unto all men. That's what he said in the 19th verse of the last chapter. And he mentions their faith being known abroad in the first chapter. It's a tremendous thing, isn't it? Well, there's one other thing that causes this church to be more diversified than what you might have thought. How in the world did these house churches get started anyway? That was not characteristic of the New Testament church in other places. There was only one church in most every city. But not in Rome. No. Most one church in every other place. The big church in Jerusalem gathered at the temple. I know they went from house to house. I know they were in the house of Mary. But we don't really have a record of there being a lot of house churches until we get to Rome. There's house churches here. How can this pattern be? Well, when I explain this pattern, you'll find that there's more diversity than you might first have thought. That diversity came, or those multiple churches came out of the existing synagogue pattern, Jewish synagogue pattern. The Jewish synagogues in Rome were divided not so much along geographical locations, but were divided according to social, economic, and religious reasons. There was a synagogue of wealthy Jewish people. There was a synagogue. These synagogues were built around social, maybe a mercantile constituency, or religious, meaning they're religious Jews who carried the favor of Rome, and there was religious Jews just like today who were very separatist in their thinking and kept their traditional ways. So they had a synagogue different. They just congregated in different areas. Now, when the gospel came and it was preached into these synagogues, the remnant that came out, those who believed, still had certain ways of thinking, and that close by those synagogues, they established their churches. So you had house churches close by. All of this wasn't melted overnight. But now this is theory, but it sounds like it might be that way. That because of the existing pattern of the Jewish synagogues built around social, economic, and religious reasons, you have at least the basic reason why there were different churches scattered over Rome, because it was not characteristic of the church anywhere in the empire. Now, in going into the synagogues, the Christians apparently stirred up quite a fuss, or there was quite a reaction to them. And if you don't remember how some Jewish people could react, you'll have to remember that when Paul was speaking there and he spoke as he did, some of them got so upset they tore their clothes and threw dirt in the air. Now, I've been in a lot of church meetings, but I've never seen anybody tear their clothes, and I've never seen anybody throw dirt in there. Friend, you've got to be upset to throw dirt. And you've got to be upset to tear your clothes. And Paul upset them so much that 40 of them took a vow that they'd not eat until Paul was dealt with. And they either broke that vow or died. So they took 40 of them, determined in their mind that we're not going to eat until Paul was dead. Well, Paul was escorted out of Jerusalem with a large troop of Roman soldiers. God didn't care what kind of vow they took. They weren't going to be impeded. He was going to get Paul to Rome. Over the dead bodies of 40 starved Jews if necessary. But I'm mentioning this to tell you what kind of reaction was going on. And here these Jewish men now, not Gentile, but Jewish men who were believers were going into the synagogue and telling that Jesus was the Messiah and that Jesus was the great rabbi now instead of Moses. And it was causing quite a thing. The upset was so great that Claudius, in 49 AD, edicted all the Jews. He didn't understand the Jewish-Christian relationship. He just knew that these Jewish sects were causing lots of trouble. So he said that they were stirred up over Christus. They believe that meaning Jesus, the Christ. And that over this doctrine or whatever it was, it created such a stir, he just threw them all out of Rome. So the Jewish people left. They had to leave. They were evicted. And because of this edict of Claudius. Now, it was probably that eviction that cast out Priscilla and Aquila. And Paul met them in Ephesus and in Corinth. They were with him in Ephesus and in Corinth. Well, while they were gone, Gentiles took over. I'm talking about the churches. The Gentiles became dominant, and all that were saved between 49 and 54, that's when the edict ended, all that were saved added to the Gentile churches. But there were very few Jews because they weren't allowed to be there. Wouldn't say maybe that he got them all out of there, but he asked them all to leave. So the Gentile people became dominant and numerically became the most prominent group. That's probably why Paul says in Rome, in Romans 1 and 13, while it indicates that the majority is Gentile. Look at what he says. Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. And he says, I'm a debtor both to the Greeks. And so it would seem that the church was primarily Gentile, numerically, and probably dominated by the Gentiles. So they come back, and what do you have? You've got a Jewish-Christian problem. Not all of God's children have got wisdom. Not all of them know how to act. The emperor has banished all the Jews, The Gentiles have been left there. They become to a place of authority in the church, and here come the Jews back. Priscilla and Aquila, being in that group, they came back about 56. Paul wrote his letter. He was with them in Corinth in 56. They were back in Rome in 57. He wrote his letter in 57. So the edict was in 49. It was over in 54. Again, they came back in 56, and then Paul's letter was written in 57 at Corinth, just before he went to Jerusalem. So you see they're back in. Now, in the light of the Jews coming back, the return of the Jews in 54, Priscilla and Aquila in 56, keep in mind what Paul has been getting at. You can see in 9, 10, and 11, there is a problem not only between Jew and Gentile. You can see overtones of that, but a big problem of what is the relationship of the Jewish Gentile church with the larger unbelieving religious majority of Jews in Rome and over the earth. There's a problem. And so Paul writes to that problem. You can see in his ministry also that as he writes in 9, 10, and 11, you can see that it's sort of a summation of his experiences in his missionary journeys also. Remember that in 1, he's speaking primarily to the Gentile church, and 1, he explains that the Gentiles have forgotten God. They knew Him. Nature taught them that God was, but they didn't regard Him. And he tells what evil things came upon the Gentiles. Then in 2, he goes into establishing that the Jews were not any more acceptable before God. In 3, he says that all of them have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And in 4, he points to a man of faith, a Hebrew man. And he said this is the relationship that God intended, not primarily one of religious merit, that is of merit from religious activity, but one of relationship, one of trust and obedience, one of vitally connected with God, being vitally connected with God. Then in 5 and 6, 5, he talks about justification by faith. And then in 6, how we're really justified. 6, he talks about, I think he defines faith. When he says we're buried in the, baptized, that we're buried in the likeness of His death and raised in the likeness of His resurrection, what he's doing is defining faith. He's defining this that justifies. An old life that has passed away, a new life that's governed by the Lordship of Christ. And he said in one place there in the 3rd chapter, God is no respecter of persons. And he says, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. All religious and all non-religious. You can see, here's this congregation in Rome reading this letter. They're thinking about these relationships. Some where the accusation came in that God's promises had failed to Israel and now been turned over to the church. And Paul said it wasn't so. See, I heard that in my day. Paul said it isn't so. Paul says God's promises never failed, still got His hand on the Hebrew children, but he said this is the way God's worked all along. It's always been through a remnant. He said God's promises have not failed. Whoever has believed have received the promises of God and are not going to fail. But he said God has always intended that the remnant be the channel through which grace comes to those who have rejected the reality of God for that day, whatever God's doing in that day. And so he explains in 9 and 10 and 11. 11 is where grace comes through grace. And if you don't have that sermon, I want you to... I told Terry when he was listening to... when I called him this morning, he had listened to Sunday morning sermon 3 times. He's made 4 copies, given it all to his pastors. He wasn't even here with us. He's one of the most excited persons I know of. So I said, well, Terry, be sure and get the Sunday sermon 2 times before, 2 weeks before, Grace Through Grace, and the one before that on Beautiful Feet. So you can read about the remnant and read the purpose of the remnant and get ready for Romans 12, 1 and 2 when I preach here on Sunday morning. I beseech ye therefore. Now, Therefore, on what's in 1, what's in 2, what's in 3, the faith of Abraham in 4, justified by faith, the definition of faith, which is baptism, in 6, 7, the old fight between the carnal nature and the spiritual nature, and how that's ever won. And 8 tells us why. How? By following the Holy Spirit. As we follow the Spirit, the dictates of the flesh will not be satisfied. Now, I've been through all those chapters without looking into them, so you know that I know something about them. I've thought about them with you and prayed over them with you. And then, after he finishes 9, 10, and 11, I think he hits the apex of the book, for he says, and surely it was my loudest tones here Sunday morning, I beseech ye therefore, on the basis of 1 through 11, that ye present your bodies in order for you to have beautiful feet, in order for you to make the unbelieving religious majority jealous, in order for grace to come now through the remnant, I ask that you present your bodies a living sacrifice on the basis of all I've preached to you in all these passages. But he's talking about a Roman church that's more diversified than a Jerusalem church. The Jerusalem church became one, and 3,000 souls were saved in one day. And a little 5,000, and it went up. And Jerry Falwell says in about 14 years it was 200,000 in that area. I don't know how he knows that, or whether he's talking about the Middle East at that time, but I remember him saying that in about 14 years, 200,000 souls. That's a pretty big increase from 120. And God brought that church to one. But Paul has experienced the lack of oneness all through his missionary journeys, and when he got into Jerusalem, for all practical purposes, his ministry was rejected. And he's written this letter to Rome. He's heard of Rome. He wants to take the gospel up into Spain. He would like for Rome to be in the West what Antioch's been in the Mideast. Wants her to back his ministry, and he wants her to be one, and already her faith is everywhere. But he's speaking to a more diversified church than he ever was in any of his other assignments. But already she's exemplified, in spite of her diversity, she's exemplified more unity, except for the day of Pentecost. She's exemplified more unity than any of the other churches he's been at. So I'm telling you, he's dealing with an improbable possibility, but nevertheless a possibility. Now I want to ask you something, and I want to challenge you on this. Are they less or more? Were they less or more diversified than we are? Wouldn't you say they're more diversified? Wouldn't you say they're more different than we are? There's not near the difference between us, between slave and free. There's no, why, we've got women here who own property, jointly with their husband by themselves. Drive cars in their own names. They have a sense of personal responsibility. They have their own jobs. They're going up the ladder socially and economically. They've got careers. It's bursting wide open in our day. There's a whole different feeling on the part of male and female. And yet, God wants us to be one. See, when you look at the Roman church, there's less reason for her to come to oneness than us. And yet you can already see that she exemplifies a trend toward oneness because of the faith and the obedience that's over all the world. There's the possibility of the Roman church really having beautiful feet. There's a possibility that God will bring grace right through the Roman church. I want you to know He brought enough grace through the Roman church till the gospel reached you and it reached me. Without the Roman church, there wouldn't be Scott Depot. I'm so glad God's helped me not to make fun of the Catholic Church, because quite frankly, without her, there wouldn't be any Scott Depot church. I don't know that the small remnants the small remnants on the side, but though at all times she didn't exemplify purity, I do want you to know she came right out of this church we read here. And so God sent great power through the Roman church. He sent great love through her. It says that whenever Paul was crucified and Peter was crucified and Paul was decapitated, that the churches were very discouraged and very scattered, and that's when Mark wrote his letter, and they realized through reading the Gospel of Mark that Christ's life was what Paul had preached in terms of the message of the cross. They were quickened, they were encouraged, and in spite of the persecution that was going on everywhere, they became great martyrs and great saints, and God brought a great revival out of the Roman church. That gospel did grow up into Spain, probably without Paul, and it crossed the ocean with, what's his name, Christopher Columbus. It crossed the ocean with him and with others, and here we are, by God's grace, basking in the blessing of God's blessing upon the Roman church. Well, it seems to me if we look at these divisions and we look at the impossibility of the Roman church becoming one, we can take heart for ourselves. It's something to tell a church that they're all to speak the same thing. And I just thought I'd point out something to you. We all speak the same thing, by God's grace. I don't know anybody running around here that's really nurturing a doctrine different than what I'm preaching right over this Bible. Do you? Here's a Baptist minister that sang tonight, right here. Never once have he and I argued over whether we're pre, post, or millennial. We've never argued over. He came in having a doctrinal background of eternal security, of being once saved, always saved. I never had that at all. He came in with a background, not much emphasis on sanctification. I came in from a background that had a lot of emphasis on sanctification. Yet we've been speaking the same thing. We've never sat down. I've never said, now just what do you believe over here? Steve asked him one day what he believed. and when I had to be the arbitrator. It's not that David was raising the fuss, but Stephen had just read the 5 points of Calvinism, and he looked at David and said, David, you believe this stuff? David says, well, maybe 3 of them, he said. Stephen said, David. He said, Pastor, and he looked over at me, he says, my Lord, he said, I'm just saying his words now. He said, you're a greater man than I thought you were. He said, you mean tell me you've been bragging on people like John Calvin and H.A. Ironside and some of the great dispensationalists? You've been really hoisting their flag? He said, I don't know if I can do it if they believe stuff like this. Well, David was right there when I told him. I said, now, Stephen, let me have that book you got. At 5 points of Calvin. And he said, have you got this? I said, yes, I have that. I read that. I said, let's just put this aside. And we'll just trust. We're brothers in the Lord. And it was quite a moment, quite an experience. And Steve's been subdued about it ever since. Steve's probably one of the great lovers of all the churches and one of the great lovers of all men of God everywhere over the earth. Right now, that's what he's like. But you see, we had our moment of truth there. And think of these years we've been together when we've been speaking the same thing. Let me tell you something. If you preach salvation by the blood of Christ, you preach sanctification, you preach the cross, you preach that a man ought to obey God at any cost, you make the apex of your message, Romans 12, 1 and 2. I beseech you therefore, brethren, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your true worship. You make this the apex and the center. Brother, I'll tell you, everything will fall off on the margin. Everything else will go to the margin. You tell me that faith is a relationship of completely believing God and obeying Him at all costs and letting your life demonstrate that entirely. I want you to know everything else moves to the sidelights. And people are thinking of the privilege of being children of God. People are thinking of the necessity of having this old carnal nature sanctified. People are thinking, oh Lord, how do I get myself holy and acceptable before Thee? And how may I wait upon Thee and discern the will of God? That's a message where we all speak the same thing. And that's been the need down through the years. The Roman church was becoming like that. Though she was a diversified church, there was a possibility And indeed, it was a probability. She did indeed become a remnant and a channel of grace in that day. And if she can do it, so can we. By God's grace. By His grace, His love, and His mercy. I thank you for your patience with me in getting over the archaeological evidence, but you see, it was so pertinent. It was so important. I'm looking forward. Did you know that yesterday morning I was up before 4 o'clock, and from 4 to 6 I was working on Sunday morning's message. You know, that's all I can do to keep from pushing this table real big and starting all over again and giving you Sunday, just unloading right now. That's how excited I am. I'm ready to go. I can't hardly wait to tell you that in Romans 12:3, he's going to tell us how to have beautiful feet. Going to tell us how to be the remnant. He's going to tell us how to love one another. He's going to tell us how to be in relationship with one another in the church. And he's going to start off with a negative. Not to think too highly of ourselves. I'm already preaching. I better quit or my Sunday message will be gone. Praise the Lord. I'm thankful